Welcome to Headline Geopolitics. I'm your host, José Niño, and today I'm joined by Ray McGovern, a former CIA analyst who has served under 7 U.S. presidents from John F. Kennedy through George H.W. Bush. And since he's retired, he's become one of the leading voices in the anti-war movement and has been the co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPS, a group that has challenged the use of false intelligence to justify the Iraq War. Ray, it's an absolute honor to have you on Headline Geopolitics.
The honor is mine.
All right, let's just start with your background. You spent close to 3 decades at the CIA, and from what I could take it, you served as a Soviet analyst where you briefed presidents and you witnessed U.S. foreign policy evolved from the Kennedy years through the end of the Cold War. What initially drew you to the intelligence world, and what did you learn during those years that shaped how you view U.S. foreign policy in the present?
Well, Jose, it's a long story, but I'll keep it short. By happenstance, when I was in college, I decided to major in Russian. I'm pretty good at languages. I was sick of French and sick of Latin and Greek, and Russian was really attractive, so I did. I majored in that, took a master's degree in that, and my decision to major in Russian came in 1958. Do the math. So, suffice it to say that when things started to get pretty hot and heavy with the Soviet Union, I was equipped to deal with that. I did my 2 years in the U.S. Army as an infantry intelligence officer, and then it was a natural gravitation toward being an analyst with the CIA. And I emphasize analyst because I was not privy to nor supportive of some of the covert action things that went on behind the turnstiles in our CIA new building at the time. 1963 is the time. April is when I started. November, of course, is when the president who drew me down to Washington was killed. So, beyond those turnstiles, and there were turnstiles on every floor of that 7-story building, okay? Beyond those turnstiles, the covert action people had all the money, had all the action, so to speak. We did our best to fulfill the reason that President Truman set us up in the first place, and that was he wanted untreated intelligence. He didn't want to hear from the State Department. He didn't want to hear from the Defense Department, always saying the Russians were 10 feet tall. He wanted to create an agency responsible to him only that would have, we analysts would have career protection to tell them the truth. Can you imagine? Well, it worked for the first 2/3 of my career. Later, there were people who came in and just kind of they corrupted the process of analyzing Russia, and that's the beginning of a very sad story that happened in 1981. And it's the same sense that people have been caricaturing Putin and the Russians as evil incarnate, and that's one reason we're in such a fix we are today with respect to Ukraine.
One thing I noticed about your background is that you were involved in analyzing Soviet policy during the détente era, and especially the signing of the anti-ballistic missile treaty of 1972. Looking back, how did those experiences influence your understanding of the renewed tensions between the United States and Russia since the end of the Cold War?
Good question, Jose. I'll remind people that I was one of those school children who hid under my desk to protect myself from the atom bomb that the Russians were about to send our way into the Bronx. Okay. Now, so that was 19 1953, I graduated from grammar school. Fast forward to 1970 actually, when I became a chief of the Soviet foreign policy branch of CIA. And we were, of course, watching the Russians very closely. And the question came up, would the Russians be interested in an agreement that stopped the proliferation of armed missiles and so forth, that stopped the uncanny costs of keeping up one with the other? And we thought they were, because they didn't want to be spent into oblivion, and they said so. Then came President Nixon and Kissinger. Now, we didn't know that Kissinger was going to go to China, to Beijing, but he did in 1971 and opened up the door that the Russians feared the most. And that door was that China would develop a more cordial relationship with the United States than the Russians could, okay? It was a triangular relationship, okay? And the Russians were hell-bent on preventing China from developing a more decent relationship that they could work out with the U.S. And so Kissinger came to us and said, whoa, what do you think? Are the Russians interested in arms control? And we said yes, for two reasons. One, they don't want to be spent into oblivion. They know we could do that. Number two, they're deathly afraid that the Chinese are going to steal a march on them in relationship with you. And so it looks like your ploy is working, because as soon as you went to Beijing, and as soon as Nixon went to Beijing in January 1972, all of a sudden the Russians were much more flexible on very thorny issues, including the four-power agreement on Berlin, which had been languishing and contention. They came to an agreement on that right quick. So we said to Kissinger, and this is a rare thing, we're usually the skunk at the picnic, right? But we're able to say to Kissinger, look, it's working. We think, and we're watching the delegations very closely. I had three people in my branch working on the SALT. So SALT was Strategic Arms Limitation talks, which yielded the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Okay, now we had one with the delegation. One of my people was with the military analysts. The other one was reporting to Director Helms and other muckety-mucks in Washington. So we were right in there, and finally Kissinger said, well, okay, they're showing a lot of flexibility. How does it look? And we said, well, you're right. I mean, we agree with you this time. No skunk at the picnic here. We think it's working. Okay. Long story short, I get to go to Moscow. My opposite number at state was later Ambassador Jack Matlock. He was the desk chief at state. I was the Soviet foreign policy branch chief. Suffice it to say that for the first time in history, we had a balance of terror. A balance that nobody liked, but was hell of a lot better than no balance at all. And in a word, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty delimited the number of anti-ballistic missile sites in each country to 2. And then they said, why do you need 2? The country cannot be defended against the retaliatory strike if there's a first strike by the other country. So let's make it down to 1, okay? Now, long story short, I was there. They signed that. I looked around. I said, my God, you don't have to hide under your desk anymore, right? And you had this personal role, and I felt terrific. Then Kissinger says, all right, now, if they cheat, are they going to cheat, McGovern? I can't say they're not going to cheat. Well, if they cheat, how soon can you tell us? So I went back to our people who run the satellites and all the other sensitive collection devices, and they told me, we'll know in a week. And so I went back, we'll know in a week. No, that's good enough. The thing was signed, okay? Did they cheat? Yeah, they cheated. Did we catch them? Yeah, we caught them. Within a week? Yes, we did. Okay. You have to realize that by that time, these satellites were coming into their own. We saw this god-awful mass radar being constructed in a place called Krasnoyarsk in the middle of Siberia. It could only be an ABM radar precluded from the treaty as it existed at that time. We told Reagan, and Reagan said, all right, go to Moscow and show them those photos. Okay. So the Russians, of course, said, I don't understand. Until Gorbachev came in about 85, 86. Then George Bush was finally president, George H.W. Bush. And he and Gorbachev said, all right, look, we know it's a ABM radar. Are you going to tear it down? And Gorbachev said, yeah, we'll tear it down. You're right. So all I'm saying here is that CIA played a really important role in supporting people like Jack Matlock, who felt the same as we did with respect to whether this China ploy was working and whether the Russians were really interested. And our role, of course, was to say, if they cheat, we can verify. That was the beginning of doverai no proverai, the Russian for trust but verify. And, that came into view with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty later, but that was worked out with Gorbachev and Reagan, 1987, which unfortunately Trump, ill-advised, got out of the last year of his tenure. So that treaty is gone by the board. That lasted for 33 years. The ABM treaty went by the board under George W. Bush. That lasted for 30 years. So there was a balance of terror. Terror doesn't sound good, but at least there was a balance. There was no way that either side thought that they could get away with a preliminary, or what they call a principal strike, to be the first to strike without suffering devastating retaliation. Balance is better than no balance. And now, just to finish up here, the Russians have recommended that even though the only strategic arms limitation treaty that still exists, the New START, that expires in February 5th of the coming year. There's no way that can be lengthened under the terms of the treaty, but President Putin of Russia has decided, look, we're not gonna violate the terms of the quantitative limits on offensive strategic missiles, which, if memory serves, are 1,550, down from some like 7,000. Okay, we're not going to violate those limits as long as you don't. And so that offer is on the table. And what Trump has said is, this sounds like a good idea to me. But the Russians have asked, please, Mr. Trump, something a little bit more official than sounds like a good idea to you. And that hangs in the balance right now. That's the biggie. That's the biggest one, because arms control has always been a preliminary step toward more rapprochement, more détente, a more livable or decent relationship with these two giants. Let's hope that the Trump administration sees its way to say, all right, we won't violate the treaty either. Meanwhile, let's get down to brass tacks and see if we can negotiate a follow-on so that we can still have a balance. We're in danger of having no balance at all right now.
One point you raised there that caught my attention was the Trump administration's withdrawal from the ABM treaty. On the campaign trail in 2016, Trump was always talking about mending ties with Russia, but his administration, his first term at least, was actually quite hawkish when it comes to military aid, withdrawing from the treaty, ABM treaty, and specifically the military aid to Ukraine, the lethal military aid, and then sanctions on Russia. And I believe they also greenlit attacks against Russian contractors in Syria too, among other things. What explains the Trump administration's more hawkish turn in his first term and continued reluctance to restore ties with Russia, fully restore like cordial ties?
Mm-hmm. Well, just a minor correction, Jose. it was George W. Bush that got out of the ABM treaty. He did that in 2002. Remember, it was concluded in 1972, 30 years of balance. It was Trump himself that got out of this other treaty, which was
Open skies.
The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and that was concluded in 1987 with Gorbachev and Reagan. Now, that was an even more amazing treaty because for the first time in the history of arms control, an entire class of weaponry, an entire class of medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles with their nuclear warheads was chopped in half and destroyed. It was already in place. My God, nobody thought that. I didn't even think that would be possible, but with goodwill on each side and with doverai no proverai, trust but verify. And one of my friends, Scott Ritter, was on the scene there for 2.5 years at a god-awful place called Votkinsk in Siberia to verify that these SS-20s were being chopped up. Anyhow, that was unique in the history of warfare. That lasted 33 years before somebody like John Bolton or some of these other crazies said to President Trump, hey, look, people are saying you're soft on Russia. You're soft on Russia. Well, let's show them. Let's get out of this Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. So in 2019, on his way out, Trump listens to these people and cancels that treaty, mostly because the U.S. wanted to use missiles that were prohibited by the treaty. They had already developed them. They accused the Russians of violating the treaty. Of course, that's what you usually do. But that was even more sorrowful because that's coming back to roost now with all this talk about the Tomahawk and other intermediate range or strategic weapons in their own right, which can carry a nuclear weapon.
All right, let's shift the discussion more towards the Middle East because that's the big topic right now with the recent developments in Gaza. We're now in the aftermath of this temporary ceasefire, though we do see Israel, as usual, breaking it in certain respects, and the U.S. is continuing to support it for obvious reasons. What is your general assessment of the latest ceasefire and Israel's broader campaign in Gaza?
Yeah. Jose, if I may, I'd just like to add a footnote to the business about why, as you asked, Americans hate Russians so much. Why Trump, during his 4 years the first time around, was actually more angry and more offensive toward the Russians than most other presidents. And the answer is simple. I mentioned my friend, Ambassador Jack Matlock. He wrote recently, about 3 weeks ago, look, the reason is simply Russiagate. Russiagate, this fairy tale that was invented to accuse Trump of having garnered support from Russia to get to be president, that the Russians, Putin, were responsible for giving us Trump, and we know, of course, now that this was all concocted by the geniuses on Hillary Clinton's staff, like Jake Sullivan. It was made out of whole cloth. That's clear now, but for those 4 years, Americans were brainwashed, and I use that term advisedly, brainwashed into thinking, number one, the Russians were out to do us in. They had interfered with our election and so forth. And Trump felt he was so circumscribed, he was so emasculated, if you will, that he couldn't do a thing about creating a more decent relationship with Russia. Not a bad idea, by the way, a more decent relationship with Russia, assuming, as I do, it's more than an assumption, it's a certitude that the Russians don't want to take over the world anymore. They don't even want to take over Ukraine completely, or Poland, or Russia, Europe. And I can prove that by what's happened with respect to Russian policy toward Ukraine. So sorry about that. With respect to, sorry about having to add that footnote. With respect to Gaza, Jose, I can hardly address this without tears. I never thought that I would be part of that America that I love would be part of a genocide, enabling, arming, financing, encouraging genocide. Now, genocide is what everyone knows is the case there in Gaza. The UN has decreed that. The notion that not only genocide with rockets and missiles of all kinds, but with forced starvation, my God, that this will continue now, as all my Middle Eastern experts advise me, it's a done deal. Trump was able to advertise this ceasefire. It's not going to end the hostage exchange, of course. It's not going to last very long. And the pity of it all is that Trump could end it with a phone call. Instead, he goes to Tel Aviv, West Jerusalem, and says, look, this genocidal guy, Netanyahu, has my full support. I really like this guy. He's going to be fine. Just give it another week, and that whole thing will look the same as it did before. And lastly, how many people have perished? Well, most people were saying at the beginning that there were about 2.5 million Palestinians in Gaza, all of them displaced in 1948 from the territories they had inhabited for centuries in the other part of the occupied territory. So how many are left? Well, conservative estimates talk about 236,000 Palestinians in Gaza either killed or badly wounded. That's 10%. 10% of the entire people, these Palestinians in Gaza. So are we going to wait for the next 10% before we Americans stand up and say, look, this is not America. We don't justify genocide. We don't want our taxpayers' money going to Netanyahu, who, as I say, is a war criminal, pure and simple. Assisting him puts you in that same category. My God, if we Americans can't stand up and say to our legislators and our representatives and to anybody who will listen, stop this genocide, well, it's beyond me. And as I say, it's a very sad thing. The forced hunger, the forced starvation, well, I was lucky enough. My great-grandparents escaped that forced starvation in Ireland. I know a little bit about that because I grew up with my Irish grandmother, and she told me, well, we won't go into that, but my God, the prospect that the American people are being asked to support this when a phone call from Trump could end it, it's, I guess I've said enough.
Do you believe that in light of the U.S.'s just full-throated support of Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign since October 7th, whether it's Biden and Trump just giving the green light here, do you think that the U.S. has completely lost moral and diplomatic credibility in the region for backing Israel?
Simple answer, yes. One thing that troubles me greatly, Jose, this happened before, right? I was 9 years old in 1948 when all of a sudden I was told that a people without a land, the Jews that had been persecuted by Hitler, were being given a land without a people. Oh, how great. In the Bronx, where I grew up, there were parades down the Grand Concourse. Everyone was so happy. There was this empty land being given to this people to finally have their own country, right? Okay. No one told me that that 700,000 plus Palestinians were driven out of that land into places like Gaza. Most of them ended up in Gaza, okay? Then there's a diaspora as well in 1948 and the following years. Nobody told me that, okay? So this is at the core of this politicization or this propaganda, where most people don't really have the straight story, partly because of the Zionist influence, not only in our government, but in our media. And that is changing now because, to my satisfaction, American people are showing that they really don't like a genocide. And it's clear because everybody has an iPhone and they can see what's going on. So that's changing. And that may account in part for this temporary exchange of hostages and ceasefire. Let's see what happens in the next weeks. I don't hold out much hope that this will. There's another thing there that people probably should be aware of. Biden was run by two Zionists, Jacob Sullivan and Antony Blinken, out and out self-professed Zionists. Okay, of course, Biden himself advertised himself as the most loyal Zionist in the world. That's a quote, okay? But when Netanyahu came in, when Trump came in, he had some flexibility to deal with Netanyahu. He didn't have to jump in with both feet, but he jumped in with all his feet. Count them, two of them, okay? Why? Well, I suspect that Netanyahu has a lot of dirt on Trump. There's this fellow called Epstein. He was a Mossad agent, pure and simple. And we have a former Mossad agent who has pretty much said, look, Trump, you can end this genocide. Just release the Epstein files. It won't be good for you. It will be very embarrassing, but it will end the genocide and they won't have the blackmail potential on you anymore. So please, please do that. His name is Ben Menashe, okay? He's a reliable source. I know that from the person who taught me journalism, Robert Parry. He used Ben Menashe as a source for his excellent work on the October surprise with the hostages in Iran released just on inaugural day so that President Reagan was sure to beat Jimmy Carter.
From the interviews I've seen you participate in, you've largely described the U.S.-Israel relationship as one of subservience rather than partnership. Do you see any real shift among American officials or the public on this issue, especially after the humanitarian catastrophe that took place in Gaza?
I do, but it persists. Let me give you an example. In the Bronx, we would say, I'll give you a for instance. So Jose, here's a for instance. John Mearsheimer, the dean of the Realism School of International Relations, he's a professor at University of Chicago, and Stephen Walt, a professor at Harvard, had the guts to write an article on the Israel lobby. The year was something like 2005, 2006, okay? So they were commissioned to write this by a very prominent periodical in the United States, but when they saw the draft about the power of the Israel lobby, they said, we can't publish this. Yeah, we'll pay you what we promised, but please find some other. Well, they couldn't find anybody else in the United States to publish it, so they went to the London Review of Books, published the initial draft, okay? So what happens? I'm reading that draft on a plane going to a place called Springfield, Missouri. I was talking about how my former colleagues had been prostituted, that's the word actually, into falsifying information to justify an unnecessary war on Iraq. Okay, so I'm going down the country where people listen to me. I'm in this church hall in Springfield, Missouri, Many 300 people, they said, were there. Okay, so I'm giving this talk on Iraq, and then finally in the Q&A, person says, "What do you think of Mearsheimer and Walt's thing on the power of the Israel lobby?" And I said, "Well, I'm glad I read that on a plane coming down." I said, "Well, I think it's really, really powerful, but they missed the main example." And so he said, "What do you mean the main example?" And I said, "They missed the USS Liberty." It's then that Israel realized it could get away with murder, literally, and the U.S. would say nothing about it, even if it was its own sailors. Okay. Oh, everybody. Well, I said, "Well, how many people know about the USS Liberty?" 3 hands go up of the 300. Guy in the back, guy in the middle. I told the guy in the front, says, "Sir, you have your hand up. Tell us what you know about the USS Liberty." Ramrod straight. "Sir, my name is Bryce Lockwood, Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps, retired. Member of USS Liberty crew, sir." Well, Mr. Lockwood, would you be able to come up here and tell what happened? You were there? Yes, I was there, sir. I was I was bringing in the sensitive commo equipment to drop with this great big rock into the Mediterranean. I was behind the bulwark. My Marine detachment of 20 were all killed except one when the torpedo from the Israeli PT boats put a big hole in our compartment. I said, "Would you tell us about that?" He said, "Well, I have not been able to do that yet, sir." Mind you, this is 2006, okay? But I think I'd like to try that today. So he gets up and he talks about this, how the explosion, most of his people washed out through the hole into the Mediterranean. 2 were still flailing around trying to swim. He opens the hatch, gets one of them up with some help from the people on the top, goes back, and the last guy has gone out. Talk about PTSD. Talk to Bryce Lockwood and the other USS Liberty survivors. 34 sailors were killed that day, June 8th, 1967. 174 were deeply wounded, and they were told, "Do not say anything about this, because if you do, you will be court-martialed." They couldn't even talk to their wives about who had driven that hole into the ship. So all I'm saying is that this was proof positive that the Israelis were protected by Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, and to its disgrace, the rest of the U.S. Navy from knowing what happened there on that fateful day. And that way, the Israelis do realize that they could literally get away with murder. That was my long answer to that Q&A. But Bryce Lockwood, he's still around. Talk to him. He and his fellow survivors tell a tale of infamy, and it's just one of the most tangible examples of how the Israelis really drive this ship. And for political and other reasons, our administrations from LBJ right to the present day are overly influenced by what our first president warned against, okay? George Washington in his farewell address, unreasonable attachments, okay? Beware, don't have unreasonable attachments to other countries whose interests are not the same as yours. I wish somebody had listened to George Washington. Certainly no recent U.S. president has.
Indeed, there is always the tendency of getting into these entangling alliances and troublesome coalitions that lead to further conflict. And the Israel question is one that extends beyond its conflict with the Palestinians, but also with other actors in its region. This is a good spot to transition here, where another big concern right now is whether Israel's expansionist ambitions will widen into a direct confrontation with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Given your knowledge of just like intelligence planning and escalation patterns, how real would you say is the risk of a full scale war between Israel and Iran kicking off?
Jose, I'm an outlier on this one. It's just a matter of logic to me. Last time around, the Israelis tried to beat the hell out of Iran by bombing all their known uh, nuclear facilities, and they persuaded Trump to join in. Okay, and Trump pretended or claimed that they had all been obliterated, which is not the case. Okay. Now, what happened? Well, after the Israelis launched that surprise attacks are not really nice things. I remember Pearl Harbor. Okay. I was only 3 years old, but I remember it. Okay. So the surprise attack, which the U.S. joined, what happened? Well, by the time the Iranians got their defenses up and their missiles ready, their hypersonic missiles, homegrown, mind you, that the U.S. doesn't have anymore, and that the Israelis and the U.S. cannot defend against, they wreaked havoc in Israel proper. They knocked out Haifa, where the oil refineries are. They hit airfields within Israel, so much so that Israel asked Daddy Trump, please get a time out here, get a time out for God's sake. And so there was Trump saying, look, we need a ceasefire. And they pulled their chestnuts out of the fire. So here's my logic. If the Iranians have that kind of deterrent, missiles that cannot be shot down, and they have demonstrated that they do, is Israel likely to commit suicide? I don't think so. Now, if because of domestic political considerations, Netanyahu decides to do this anyway, will the U.S. jump in like it did last time? I don't know. I guess you have to sort of say it's probable that they will, given the constellation of political forces. But what happens then? What happens when Israel is in extremis, as the smart people say? Do you think that a guy who does genocide and forced starvation and blackmail, do you think that he would shrink from using his little nuclear weapons? I don't think he would. Okay. So we have the makings of a really, really bad situation there. I tend to think that I was saying virtually all of my colleagues are saying it's inevitable that Israel will strike out on Iran again, probably in the next month. You have to show me. I don't know. I don't think that Israel is willing to make that kind of gamble. And a lot depends on whether there are any smart people left around Trump who say, look, the same thing's going to happen as it did last time. They're going to be asking us to pull them out, and they're going to be devastated by counterattacks from Iranian missiles, of which there are thousands, not to mention Russia and China coming in and helping Iran in every other way save direct military intervention. So that's a long-winded answer. I don't mind being an outlier. We'll see what happens. We'll see if I'm right, or we'll see if almost all of my colleagues are. But it's a very big danger. The nuclear thing is what bothers me, because if it goes that route, I don't think Netanyahu would shrink from ordering his folks to use nuclear weapons, the so-called Samson option, where literally Samson pulls down all the pillars on the temple and kills everybody.
Do you think that Iran's growing partnership with Russia and China has changed the balance of deterrence in the region to the point, as you mentioned, that it has made Israel a bit more gun shy about renewing like another set of punitive strikes against Iran?
I like to think so, but I cannot be sure. It all depends on a very irascible Netanyahu and a very devoted, if that's the right word, Trump to Netanyahu's aims. With respect to Russia, it's a strategic issue. Iran is on the soft underbelly of Russia. This is very delicate territory, all right? From Iran, all kinds of insurrections and all kinds of terrorism has emerged into the southern districts of Russia. It's a strategic issue, and Russia's going to step up this time, at least with enhanced deliveries of fighter bombers and other actually defense installations that we haven't seen go into places like Iran before. Whether that will be in time or within the next month is another question. China, my God, China depends on oil from the Persian Gulf, from Iran, for last I thought was about 20% of its oil consumption. My God, that's a lot. I mean, when you talk about 1.5 billion people, that's a lot of oil. So China has a vested interest in not letting Iran be wiped off the map. So I like to think that these realities will dawn on Netanyahu and on Trump, but I have no guarantee they will, because they are both totally unpredictable, and they both have personal reasons. As I mentioned, the blackmail aspect with respect to Netanyahu. If he goes to trial in Tel Aviv and the president does not pardon him, as Trump suggested he do, well, he's easily convictable. And they have this bridal suite in one of the prisons there in West Jerusalem ready for him and his wife, Netanyahu and his lovely wife, to serve the rest of his life there, because the charges are completely sustainable. It all depends on whether they have the guts to do that and what Trump can do to persuade the president of Israel, my God, to issue a preemptive pardon. That's what we'll come to.
Let's go back to Russia, because it seems that things are probably about to escalate with this talk of the U.S. delivering Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Do you see this as a potential game changer, or is it just another form of escalation that's an exercise in futility in the long term, just because of the simple fact that Russia has the upper hand and, structurally speaking, has escalatory dominance in Ukraine?
Well, the Tomahawk is, to use the vernacular, a nothing burger. Now, there are all kinds of reasons that I could adduce here. I'll name some of them. There aren't any. The U.S. is low on inventory of Tomahawk missiles. They're 50 years old. Do they work still? They might. How many do you need to knock out a site? Well, you need a volley of them, maybe 20, 30, 40, or even 50, unless they have nuclear weapons on them. Now, that's the fly in the ointment. Are there Tomahawk missiles that are equipped to do nuclear strikes? Well, they were all destroyed under the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that I mentioned before. Now, could they be rehabilitated? Well, it's going to be hard, because the Tomahawk missiles now are fired from ships and from submarines. And the Ukrainian Navy has no ships and has no submarines. So could they convert it into a land-based sort of thing? Could they take the canister out of the bowels of one of these ships and put it into Ukraine? Well, I suppose they could. Would it work? I don't know. They really have to test it. Would the Russians know about it? Of course the Russians would know about it. In other words, there aren't any Tomahawks ready. The whole thing was raised by this guy, General Kellogg, a real hardliner, with Zelensky. This would be a good idea. Let's agitate for tomahawk. Now, I may be disproven tomorrow because Zelensky is due in Washington tomorrow. No, it's on Friday. Okay, what's today? Thursday. Anyhow, he's due there on Friday. Now, what will Trump do? What has he said? He said, well, I'll consider giving tomahawks. Of course, yeah, because, unless Putin ends that war in Ukraine, my God, I'll consider it. But yesterday he said, well, we've been talking about defensive weapons for Ukraine, and I haven't really, it's very clear he hasn't decided yet. What do I think he'll decide? I think he'll decide, well, if he wants to keep up this nothing burger thing for PR purposes, and the PR purposes is to indicate to the Europeans that, look, we're willing to do our part here to help Zelensky if you guys come through with the cash. After all, the way things are set up now, nothing goes to Ukraine except before it's sold to the Europeans, and the Europeans find a way to get those tomahawks to Ukraine. There are no ways to fire these tomahawks without integral U.S. involvement. Putin has already said that. It's not going to happen. So with all this propaganda and all this artificial stoking up of tomahawk, it's one of these canards. It's one of these red herrings. It's never going to happen. But it's useful for Trump to say, well, I can do this. But is he going to do it? Well, if he tries to do it, it's going to take years. And by that time, the Russian army will have finished off the Ukrainian army. Whether they take all the territory east of the Dnieper or not, territory is not the issue. The issue is destroying the armed forces of Ukraine and then destroying the pro-Nazi regime in Kiev. The first is almost accomplished. The second's going to take a lot more work. But the Russians are succeeding in that dual purpose, and there's nothing that tomahawks or anything else can do to prevent the inevitable defeat of Ukrainian forces this year. Mark my words.
Where do you think the conflict is going in terms of the outlook for Ukraine? Will the Ukrainian state remain intact, or will it end up as a rump state when the smoke clears from this conflict?
Well, Jose, let me just go back to when Obama was president 10 years ago. He said something sensible. He said, look, the worst thing we can do for the Ukrainians is to give them the idea that they could prevail in a war with Russia. So for God's sake, let's not give them offensive arms. He said that 2015. Now, on that same week, there was a deputy secretary of state who said, Mr. President, that's exactly right, because every weapon we would give to Ukraine would be matched by Russia, and then doubled, and then tripled, and then quadrupled, end quote. Oh, who is that deputy secretary of state? His name was Tony Blinken. So, what happened? Biden comes in. Who is he picked to be the secretary of state? Tony Blinken. Does he change his tune? Of course he changes his tune, because he's a Zionist and because he's a hardliner and because Jacob Sullivan, the national security advisor, is in the same camp. And they say to sleepy Joe Biden, look, we can prevail against Russia. And then they get these clowns as head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Yeah, well, sure, we can prevail against Russia. Did they not look at a map? For God's sake, did they not look at supply lines? Did they not look at the potential of the Russian industrial complex to build these weapons and to prevail? Maybe they thought, I don't know what they thought, but they were crazy. Now they're still around. General Kellogg's still around. What does he say? He's saying Ukraine is winning. Can you imagine? And the Russian economy is falling apart. Nonsense. Nonsense is the nicest word I can say. So what I'm saying here is that uh, if people like Witkoff or people, I don't know even their names, if they're sensible people around Trump, or if by chance somebody gives him a copy of the major judgments in the 5 memoranda veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity wrote to Biden, and which he did not heed about what was going on the ground in Ukraine, unless that happens, I don't know what Trump's going to do. But I suggest that there are enough people around that will say, look, tomahawks, number one, can't be in place for a couple of years. We don't know how we get them from submarine tubes and tubes. It's sort of complicated, and we could sell them to the Europeans, but they don't have any money and then the Ukrainians don't have money to. Other than that, it's a great idea, Mr. President, but soft pedal it. So tomorrow I may be proven wrong. In the worst case, if I'm proven wrong, as would not be the first case, Trump, for whatever reason, says, yeah, we're going to give them tomahawks. And then the Russians are going to say, all right, we're going to give them tomahawks. We'll play along with that. We'll object strenuously. And meanwhile, we'll beat the living daylights out of Ukraine. It'll just be a few more weeks before we have done in the Ukrainian army. We'll work on the Nazis in Kiev next. We're prevailing, and that's the thing that's lost sight of by all these analysts. Russia has won, okay? It's not that Ukraine is winning. Russia has won hands down, and that's the backdrop for all this. Putin doesn't have to worry a lot about internal opposition he's won, and he can demonstrate that he's won. And the last couple of days, the last week of the fighting in Ukraine demonstrates without any doubt that the Russian army now is equipped and ready to form the kind of cauldron that the Russians are so much in favor of against what remains of the Ukrainian forces in the Donetsk area. And it'll be curtains for those fellas because they'll either have to surrender or try to escape. And that's not going to be possible. So just going back to what Obama said, one of the few sensible things that Obama said was, look, the worst thing we can do for the Ukrainians is to give them the idea that they could prevail against a much stronger Russia. Actually, now that I'm thinking about that, Trump said the same thing 3 weeks ago. Russia is much stronger. The Ukrainians fight valiantly, but Russia is a much stronger country. So there are glimmers of light in Trump's outlook on this thing. He will be making these decisions. Let's hope I'm right, and that he doesn't say tomorrow, oh yeah, we're going to give them not only tomahawks, but we'll give them A, B, and C as well. They're going to prevail. The Russian can't. That would be idiocy, but it would not be unprecedented.
Let's bring the focus now closer to home, specifically the Western Hemisphere. There seems to be greater escalation between the United States and Venezuela with all of these punitive strikes against so-called drug boats in the Caribbean. And then there's this new report that came out, the New York Times came out with, that the Trump administration is apparently greenlit covert operations in Venezuela to ostensibly take down the government of Nicolás Maduro. What do you make of these moves? Do you think that this are the signs of a potential long-term regime change plan?
Well, in broadest terms, Jose, I would say this is kind of a result of the tectonic shift of power from in the world toward the East. Nowhere better demonstrated than in China, especially during the anniversary celebrations for China's victory over Japan, China and U.S., okay? Look at all those folks there. That's the vast majority of the world, and that's where the power lies, not any longer in NATO and the West, okay? So that's the macrocosm that we should look at these things. Now, what did Trump do? Well, there are two things that happened. There was this leaked report of a new national defense strategy, which would say, well, it's not so much China, it's not so much Russia or Ukraine. It's it's our own hemisphere, and it's our own homeland. That's what we're going to devote our U.S. forces to. Okay, now, that's real enough. Okay, it hasn't been fleshed out, but apparently it was written by the same guy who, until then, was rabidly anti-China and saying, "No, I got to match the Chinese out there," despite the ineptitude of the U.S. Navy in being able to cope with the Chinese Navy these days. Okay, now the other thing was this. I think Trump and his courtiers felt a need to show that they're really a power to be reckoned with, okay? And so what did they do? Well, I draw a parallel here. In 1983, when I was still on active duty with the agency, there was this terrible incident in Beirut in which 241 Marines were blown up, were killed in their barracks in Beirut. Big mistake to have a bunch of Marines in a barracks in Beirut, okay? There is evidence that Israel knew this was going to happen and did not forewarn the U.S. Anyhow, that happened. Now, Ronald Reagan was sensible enough to say, oh, my God, why the hell did we have those Marines there, for God's sake? What should we do? And his advisors, more sensible than the ones around today, said, let's pull them the hell out of there. They're not doing any good. They're just, so they pulled all the Marines out the following February, and they stood offshore for a couple of weeks, and then they were out of there. That was a sensible thing. What else did Ronald Reagan do? This is the point. We have to show how manly we are, and so let's pick a country that we could invade to save from communists. Grenada. Grenada? Yeah, where's that? Oh, it's in the Caribbean. It's a sort of, anyhow, we can make believe that our medical students there are in danger of being held hostage by these leftist Grenadian leaders. Let's send the 82nd Airborne in there. And they did. And they did after the Grenadian leaders said, no, we'll free all these medicals. They can go home. They did that to show that the 82nd Airborne still can do things like Grenada. It was a fiasco, okay? So what am I saying here? In similar circumstances, the U.S. is humiliated by the drift of power toward the east and the feckless Europeans not helping at all. So it's got to show some way to beat its breast. Oh, Venezuela, let's shoot up. Let's kill 27 plus people there with these little boats supposedly drug running to the United States, for one of which has already turned around. I mean, let's do that. We'll show the world who's boss, and let's do Venezuela, okay? Venezuela we can do, okay? I mean, that sounds cynical. Even more cynical, and this is almost a little jocular, but within the last 5 days, President Trump has rehabilitated Christopher Columbus. Now, my grandchildren are learning, at least until now, the real story about Christopher Columbus and the blessings that he brought to the New World. Blessings in quotes, of course. Now, he's been rehabilitated. What? To help to assuage the Italian electorate? Well, that's part of it. But one thing that's not mentioned, Columbus made only one stop in the New World, in the continental New World, And that was in, guess where? Venezuela. So here we go. Venezuela, Columbus rehabilitated. Venezuela is ripe for this kind of thing. Now, to be a little bit more serious, and most of what I've said has been serious, maybe not Columbus, in veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity, we have attracted all manner of specialists, people who have been honest, people who have been scandalized by what happened to our profession before the war on Iraq. I also told you about the subordination of good conscience to careerism. Well, we asked one of these specialists on Latin America who has joined us for his views. He was a top analyst at CIA and the national intelligence setup. And I'd just like to read you what he sent me out of his own sense of duty, knowing I was going to be talking to you, Jose, this morning. He said, look, first, we have to note that like the other illustrious regime change military inventions in the past, this is an acknowledgement of Trump's utter failure for maximum pressure of the kind on Iran and so forth, but this much closer to home, okay? Second, we should expose the psyops. There's going to be a provocation. The drug running may not be enough. There'll be a provocation, and before you know, our hope is that the administration's hope, that the recruited assets within Venezuela will come to the fore and move against Maduro, the president there. Third, military operations, well, of a standoff kind. We have these, tomahawks again. We could shoot the hell out of government buildings and other air bases and so forth if we want to. That would be the third. Fourth, I think the last option is boots on the ground. Now, we've got to concede that there is unrest in Venezuela, largely because of the U.S. sanctions, and Maduro has not been the greatest of administrators. Now, he's really good at handling provocations. Witness that he ducked the latest strike on him when he was speaking publicly a couple of years ago out in the outdoors, and one of these drones came and just missed him. Okay, so he's good about avoiding that. But misery, and there is misery in Venezuela, does divide societies, and there are certainly people there, says my friend, people in the military who'd like to end the whole U.S. Maduro nightmare. Last thing he says, what about the Nobel Prize winning Maria Corina Machado? Now, she's an old friend of our intelligence agencies, and she cannot be expected to do anything constructive. She will be an enemy within. Now, she says that, if she comes in as one of the substitutes for Maduro, that she'll show clemency to the military. My friend says, military, be careful here. Be careful of that promise.
Yeah.
Reconciliation with people, with Maduro, well, that's not going to happen, and that's embarrassed the U.S. in the past. So all I'm saying here is that there are sensible people around. This particular person, I would just note, he watched what was going on from an eagle's nest perch, okay, before the intelligence was corrupted on Iraq, okay? That's 20 years ago, 20 more years ago, okay? And he refused to sign off on it. He was one of the only, there's one other that could sit among these august 12 apostles or so forth. He wouldn't do it. So he was ostracized, and now he's still ostracized, but he's willing to work with us, and to the degree we can get our product up and out, okay? This is sort of like a mini estimate I just read you. It's much longer, of course, but to the degree we can get to Trump and his advisors, first and foremost, Intelligence Director Tulsi Gabbard, the truth, not only about Venezuela, but about Ukraine. We wrote five memos to Biden on Ukraine during his 4-year tenure, and they did just the opposite. They stand up really well in retrospect. We just sent a reminder to the administration, look at these memos before you do something stupid tomorrow or on Friday when Zelensky comes begging for tomahawks and worse. Read these things and see that this is a fool's errand. And you're right, Mr. Trump, in saying, we don't say this because we don't advocate policy, but he is right in saying, this is Biden's war, okay? I can get out of that. I never would have gotten in there, and my interest here is to stop the killing. I'm going to prevail upon Zelensky to say, look, the jig is up. The Russian forces are winning. Don't believe people like Kellogg and others who are living in a magic world. And so take these things. If you want to believe the Europeans are going to come around too, because they ain't got no money, they ain't got no weapons, and they ain't got no strength of their own. How many divisions does the Pope have, says Stalin. Well, how many divisions do the Europeans have, asks Putin. Okay? So it's a conundrum. The worst thing is that most Americans are not well informed about this, except for programs like yours. And the result is that Russiagate, the artificially stoked up hatred of Putin and the Russians, and the notions that Putin invaded Ukraine in an unprovoked way with a massive force, okay, and that it was illegal. Well, lawyers dispute the illegality thing. I know and can prove that it was provoked up the kazoo, so to speak, all right, to use a Bronx expression, and it was low scale. All Putin, and this is demonstrable, all Putin wanted to do was scare the hell out of Zelensky, which he succeeded in doing. They came to an agreement in April, 6 weeks after the war, and that agreement was initialed by Zelensky's best friend negotiator and a negotiator for Putin, who Putin and Zelensky both approved, and it was knocked out of the ballpark by Boris Johnson, who came in and said, no, don't do that. No, don't cooperate. No, don't do that. We'll support you for as long as it takes. And now, dear friends, sorrowfully for the Ukrainians, it's as long as it took, okay? It's over. I hope that somebody tells Trump that he's got to deal with it, and he can deal with it, because as he continues to say, it's not his war. And maybe he does want to stop the killing. Any sensible person would.
Well, I think this is a good spot to conclude this discussion, but I was absolutely delighted by this conversation and really fascinated by the breadth of knowledge you offer, Ray. And before we leave, please let the listeners know where they can follow your work.
Well, I have a website. It's raymcgovern.com, and my webmeister has labored long and hard to make it easily searchable. So if you want to know about anything that's posted for the last 15 years, there's a search box right under my name. I'm on Twitter or X at Ray McGovern, and I have a Substack as well, which I haven't really checked recently, but I keep getting messages that more people are joining it. It's for free, so if you know about Substacks, you could look me up there too. Thank you, Jose, for having this kind of free discussion. I hope you'll let me know how your listeners or your viewers feel about what I said, and I'm happy to explain anything that they may not quite understand or that they might want to confront me on, because that's the name of this game. We have to nobody's got a corner on the truth. We got to keep the dialogue going, such as it is, and it's not much up till now.
All right. Thank you again, Ray. And as always, I'm José Niño. Thank you for tuning in to Headline Geopolitics. Until next time.